Hello and welcome to Birth of a New Dimension. My name is Aurora and I will be your host on this 1-hour exploration into higher consciousness and multidimensional perception. So first up, I usually introduce myself. If you are tuning in for the first time and you do not know who I am or why I do this show, I am a walk-in. I am not the original inhabitant of this physical form. I came into this physical form and this earthly third-dimensional physical realm on October 8th of 2001 through a hyperspace portal that I created and named the Flying Rainbow Lasagne. So it's one of those nice things that when you create or discover something, you are given the opportunity to name it, and I was given the opportunity to name the higher dimensional portal shape that I created, and I created it and named it the Flying Rainbow Lasagne. People ask me, Aurora, why lasagna? And when you look at the shape specifically, the sculptural form, not even the two-dimensional form, it is very easy to see that the edge is curly like the edge of a lasagna noodle, and that is where that came from. Interestingly enough, read a great article about some of the new formations of particles that are being observed by science around neutron stars, and science can be rather whimsical in its nomenclature and has decided to name some of these shapes that these high energy particles make similar to pasta, lasagna and fusilli. So it's very interesting how lasagna is pervading the scientific realm as much as it is pervading the realm of consciousness and spirituality. So before I get on to my topic of today, which is really going to be about the Great Pyramid at Egypt and ancient Atlantis and the connection to consciousness, I want to remind everyone within the sound of my voice that the current semester of Lessons for Full Spectrum Humans is ongoing. We have just done week 2, so it is not too late to hop on board this train. It is a 20-week course. It's like a full semester, and I do that because it's a lot to understand, it's a lot to comprehend, and it takes time to process. When I've presented the information as a condensed 6-week class over the summer, it was too intensive, and I found that it was simply asking too much of a person's inner development to go at such a fast pace. So this is spread out over the course of 5 months. There are 20 recorded lessons which students access on their own. And then we meet in weekly video conferences, which are interactive, meaning you can see me, I can see you, you can ask questions, as opposed to webinars where you can only be an observer and not a participant. This is the value of being in my class, because this is all about give and take and sending out and receiving. So, for example, information about the Merkaba. Merkaba means light body vehicle, and it is the shape of 2 interlocking tetrahedra or 4-sided pyramids. And it is not original information to me. In fact, it has been brought into current awareness or consciousness by a teacher named Drunvalo Melchizedek and many others, but he wrote a book about the sacred flower of life and the patterns in that, and it really comes from him by way of the ancient Egyptian mystery traditions, and those mystery traditions actually come out of the ancient antediluvian worldwide sophisticated culture known as Atlantis. Let me just take a little drink of juice here. You know all about me and my wonderful fresh, raw cannabis juice and vegetable juice. I'll get into that on another broadcast, but there are so many wonderful health benefits to drinking fresh, raw cannabis juice. I'll tell you all about it. But we're on the topic of ancient Atlantis and how that became, or the wisdom traditions from that culture were kept alive and seeded, like you seed a meme or you seed a garden, we're seeded into cultures such as what became Tibetan Buddhism, the Hindu tradition of the Far East, the Maya tradition of South America, Native American tradition of Turtle Island of North America, and of course, ancient Egypt. So the name of this radio show that you are listening to right now is Birth of a New Dimension. This is very consciously chosen to describe the topics that I cover in this particular forum are all about what it is necessary to prepare your mind and system of perception in order to be ready to have contact with higher dimensional beings or otherworldly hyperspace energy and information. It's basically necessary to cultivate yourself and do yoga of the perception. Like we stretch our muscles and tendons when we do yoga with our physical body, we do yoga of the perception when we stretch our mind, consciousness, awareness, belief system, and mental programming in order to be able to accommodate new concepts and new ideas. So, Earth has been under a consciousness quarantine for over 10,000 years, and this all speaks to the events of Atlantis. And I also speak about my role in Atlantis and who I was and my experience then. So let me first describe what experience was like on the surface of Earth at that era, before what would be called the fall of consciousness, or the flood. Consciousness on and awareness of organisms on the surface of the planet were totally interactive with and aware of consciousnesses that lived in other places. So that means that lived on other planets within this solar system, on other planets in other star systems, and even in other dimensional realities. So to make the distinction between extraterrestrial and extra-dimensional, a being who lives on a planet far away from Earth, but still in the same dimensional realm, would be extraterrestrial, no longer on the surface of Terra. That's her name, Earth. A being who is extra-dimensional would be defined as a being who does not inhabit the same slice of dimensional space or the same octave of dimensional reality that you inhabit. Let's talk about octaves and harmonics. I just warmed up my piano over here. On my piano, an octave is C to C, C to C. And here's another one, C to C. So all of the notes that are comprised between these two boundaries are the octave, and octave comes from the root word 8. It has 8 notes in it. If we relate it to the colors of the rainbow and the chakras on the body, there are 7 chakras on the body: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. And then we would find ourselves going up to the next octave. So it would be white light, the next, the totality. All of these notes add up to white light, but in the musical realm, it means that we just circulate back around to C, which is the beginning of the next octave. So we're talking about dimensions. We're talking about the slice of vibratory reality that you comprise. There is an enormous continuum of vibratory reality out there. I call it the ocean of consciousness. It is a sea of undifferentiated waveforms, a sea of waves of possibilities and probabilities and events and consciousness. And you are a tiny vortex or a tiny maelstrom or whirlpool, an eddy within those larger currents. you exist within a certain dimensional octave or slice. So there are areas that are denser than your level of density. There are areas that are less dense than your levels of density. So for example, Jupiter is a gas giant. It's a planet that is a gas giant. Doesn't really have a surface as we would define surface the way that Earth as a solid, rocky planet has an actual surface. However, Jupiter does have beings that inhabit the planet Jupiter. They are higher vibrational, less dense beings. So if you took your physical human body, even if you shielded it in a spacesuit, and you tried to place it on the surface of Jupiter, it would be antithetical to life because the levels of density they do not match. You would have to be a less dense individual to occupy Jupiter. And same thing with a being from Jupiter would not be able to occupy the levels of density that you occupy on Earth in your earthly body. So this means that a being from Jupiter exists in a less dense realm. They are less dense and higher vibrational than you are. Now I'm talking about an extra-dimensional creature. So even though Jupiter is a planet within the same physical reality as Earth, and that would make it extraterrestrial, I would say that a being who is from Jupiter is also extra-dimensional because they are not solid. They are not at the same rate that you are. You can tell I'm struggling with vocabulary, with the basic descriptive terms that we use to describe life and entities and consciousness, because most of the descriptive terms in English are highly anthropomorphic or human-centered and are used in order to describe earthly life. Let us also make a distinction between extra-dimensional, meaning occupying a parallel reality. There are many different versions of Earth and earthly reality, and there are even a multiplicity of versions of yourself. There are many possible versions of you, and some of them reside in another realm, which is another version of Earth on another timeline. Those would be considered extra-dimensional to your own experience, even though those beings themselves have physical corporeality. They are in the third dimension, but they are not in a third dimension that connects to the third dimension within which you reside. So it is not accessible to you. This gets into like math speak, speaking in using the vocabulary of math and mathematics and understanding what you have access to in terms of dimensional realities. I draw these distinctions because there are beings who do not live in the corporeal realm, yet whom are intimately intertwined with the experiences that Earth and the physical realm are having. So this relates to what life was like in Atlantis before, quote-unquote, the fall, before the flood. It was a galactic culture. That means that the beings who lived on the surface of Earth interacted with beings who were non-corporeal, who did not have Earth bodies or physical dense bodies, and they also interacted with beings who might have had physical dense bodies, but who existed physically far, far away. They might be 93 million miles away, they might be several light years away, they might be 13 billion light years away. And if you are that far apart physically, it means you would not be able to speak with your physical flapping mouth parts, the way that my lips and my vocal cords are speaking. You would have to speak and interact with those beings in a way that is not limited by the speed of light or linear time. So the quarantine that has been placed on Earth has been a quarantine of consciousness. limiting human understanding of what is possible, of whom you can talk to, whom you can be connected to, whom you can communicate with. The Atlantean culture was connected to beings throughout our entire cosmos. So this means connected to divergent star cultures, to different beings, some of whom were humanoid, some of whom were not humanoid. I mean, there's such a divergent array of light and consciousness in the universe. Sometimes it is contained within a humanoid vessel, but very often it is not contained within a humanoid vessel. And so in being able to converse with beings from other places, like this is, one of the first questions you want to say, hello, you're a new person. Who are you? Where are you from? Questions have to be asked in the proper way. We cannot ask the question, why is an onion? Or how heavy is the color blue? We cannot ask these questions. When you meet someone, a consciousness from a radically divergent culture, it might be necessary to ask, who are you? When are you from? At what rate are you traveling? Because I have spoken in the past how our physical form here on Earth is made of light that is matter. It is light that has the privilege of going slower than 186,000 miles per second. It is possible to be traveling at many different rates, and there are beings that are traveling a little bit faster than us, a little bit slower than us, and these are the different realms. So I'm using a lot of words here in order to paint a picture and describe a reality of beings who have physical forms, beings who don't have physical forms, beings who are vibrating at a very fast, high frequency, and we would say are very high energy beings, and the whole spectrum, all the way down to beings that are moving at an incredibly slow rate. If you are moving at such a slow rate that your entire lifespan is going to be, 13 billion years, it makes it very difficult to interact with someone whose time scale is 100 years. And I've spoken about this also, how you as a human might find it very difficult to have a conversation with a fruit fly, because you ask the fruit fly, hi, how are you doing today? And before the fruit fly can even listen to the end of your answer, it's dead. You're moving at timescales that are so radically different that it is difficult to even communicate and find a common ground. So it's beautiful that things were set up in order to accommodate an array of experiences. Some beings wish to have the experience of being in the level of density that is the third dimension, being submerged in the physical, having an actual physical form, having to work within the limitations of what humans would describe as, quote-unquote, the laws of physics. These are the set of limitations that describe the way that energy moves in the physical realm at a macroscopic level. And we need to make that distinction between at the macroscopic level, between at the physical realm, at the level of atoms or subatomic particles. Because once we divide matter up into its constituent elements and zoom in on it to its tiniest particulate form, we find that it doesn't act very much like matter at all, that the matter becomes, it jumps around hither, thither, and yon. It jumps around so much that we cannot actually define where it is. So these are one of the contradictions of living in the physical realm. On the one level, the macroscopic level, we say, this is a hard-edged object. Look, it is a table. I can touch it with my finger. Or look, it is my leg. I can poke it with my finger. And yet, if we were to examine what is happening on a subatomic level in that table or in that leg, there is really no matter there. There is really just the possibility and the uncollapsed waveform. All right. So there are some beings that chose the wild roller coaster adventure of being submerged in the physical reality. We take it for granted. You know, when you throw a ball, the ball will have a trajectory. The trajectory will be shaped like an arc. And that is something that you have learned from being here. When you were a tiny child, you probably had to learn how to throw and catch a ball. You had to learn that the ball doesn't travel in a straight line, that it goes up, it rises into the air, and then it falls down, and you have to figure out where it's going to be so you can catch it. This is the privilege that you signed on for. This is why you incorporated as a corporeal being. And of course, when you're a spirit person, you're like, yeah, I want to be a corporeal being. This is going to be a wonderful adventure. Not understanding the difficulties in the present sociocultural paradigm that you would also be subjecting yourself to in terms of survival and the hunt for resources, and even communicating with other intelligent life here, and working within, as I said, the social and cultural context that you find yourself in. Very challenging. Well, the social and cultural context of Atlantis was very, very different. First of all, high technology, higher technology than what is currently available to us. Solid state technology. This means that machines that did not have moving parts, things that could not break. So there are still evidences of that technology, but it is misinterpreted and degraded. Mostly crystals and monolithic stone structures are what are left over. So now you can see we're getting into the Great Pyramid, and we're getting into Egyptian culture. I think I've mentioned before my role in ancient Atlantis. I was not a physical, corporeal human on the face of the earth. I was my stellar consciousness, my non-earthly, non-corporeal consciousness, and I was a part of a group. I think it must be understood, must be delineated or described better, because in this place, people have individuated consciousnesses, and it is taken as a presumption, a basic presumption, that you live your life as an encapsulated, individuated consciousness. Other beings are very different. If you can consider what a beehive or an ant colony is like, or even a pod of dolphins, or a flock of birds when you've seen them flying in formation. We're talking about consciousness that is telepathically connected in a network and responds as if it is a single organism. So there are highly sophisticated star cultures that are modeled more on the realm of bees or organized insect life. And I think humans don't give enough respect and appreciation to the intelligence level of, for example, bees or ants. That humans as individuated consciousnesses tend to condescend to beings that have a hive mentality. Like, oh, you're just a hive, you're like a drone. Far from it. The hive is a sophisticated, non-localized mind. And I, in the time of Atlantis, was part of a sophisticated, non-localized mind. And guess what, folks? I am still a part of a sophisticated, non-localized mind, although my contextual position relevant to that mind is a little different, because I used to not have a corporeal form, and yet was highly interactive with the culture on Earth's surface. So this is like saying, you know, I'm not physically in your living room right now, and yet you're listening to my voice and interacting with, even if it is, you know, not directly, with my consciousness. And it is normal for this time and place. We hear voices on the radio and on television all the time. We interact with consciousnesses and ingest thoughts that are not from a person who is in our direct presence. That is what Earth's surface culture was like in the time of Atlantis. It was totally normal to receive a broadcast from a far distant star culture or a far distant thinker or a being who might look very different or live in a very different time and place. And the levels of cross-pollination of ideas were extreme, and it was beautiful. The quarantine that is going on Earth right now and in your individuated consciousnesses makes it hard to even imagine what it would be like. But if you could take something like Burning Man, the large collaborative art, sculpture, and idea exchanging forum of spontaneous, ideological cross-pollination, or any great collaborative, spontaneous art project. That is the type of mentality and creative exchange of energy that was happening. And now I'll get to the sad part. The sad part was when Earth culture became negatively affected by an invading force of consciousness that degraded and enslaved the consciousness that was corporeal in the body and on the surface of Earth. And enslaved meant that the beings who had corporeal bodies could no longer think what they wished to think and use their mind and their system of perception according to their own will. Now you, in your present mind, are not totally free. Unfortunately, you have been programmed with a hacked operating system through infancy and early childhood. That means that although your will is your own, you are playing with an instrument that is not well tuned. Like imagine if you were given a guitar at birth, but none of the strings are properly tuned, and you can only make the song patterns or the patterns of notes as best you can with the tuning that you're given. That is the present human experience on Earth's surface, because your DNA are like the poorly tuned guitar strings that are limiting the notes that you can choose to play and the combinations of notes that you can put together into the song of your mind and your perception. So some of this I get into in Galactic History. This is lesson 18 of the 20-part series. And I take it quite seriously in releasing this information. I'm not the only person in the world who knows about this history. There are many other teachers who see through direct insight and have the capacity to look back in time and see what has happened and have shared their direct perception. And it's also very similar to any form of history. If you're a German and you look back on history and you look at World War II, you might have a very different slant and description of the events of World War II than if you are an English person from Great Britain or an American from the United States or an Australian. You have a different perspective based on your cultural origins. So too is it with your take on the events of Atlantis leading up to the fall and the time afterwards. So I've read a lot of divergent things from other teachers, some of whom are relatively apologetic about those events and the invaders and what happened and how it degraded human consciousness. And I am not an apologist and am something of a hard ass. I was very, in Atlantis, very adamant that the free will and sovereignty should not be degraded. And essentially, humanity, when it was enslaved during that time, and the enslavement process took a long time and lasted for thousands of years. In order to free humanity, we had to cut the puppet strings, or it was necessary to cut the strings of manipulation that were literally controlling every single thought. So even though today you might be playing your life with an out-of-tune guitar, your genetic guitar is out of tune, but you still have sovereignty. You are allowed to choose the notes that you pluck and the songs that you sing. In Atlantis, during the height of slavery, one was not allowed to choose the very basic thoughts of your mind, of your consciousness. You could not even think the thought, quote, I am a slave, unquote. Could not even think that. What better way to keep a population enslaved than to control their perception, including their very capacity to perceive their enslavement? And if you understand reality is fractal, that means that within each larger version of reality, there's a tiny self-similar version of reality. So what happened, tens of thousands of years ago in Atlantis has then been replayed in tiny microcosmic fractal fragment in the society of this time and place. And that happens in order to give people an opportunity to break the cycles and live, to rectify the situation. I want to say live right was the word that I was reaching for. To have a corrective experience. For example, if you once went to a Thai restaurant that was not a good restaurant and you ordered pad Thai and it was made out of rotten food and it came to your plate and you said, pad Thai is horrible, I'm never eating Thai food again. That's because of the restaurant. If you then were brought to a good restaurant and fed a good platter of pad Thai prepared with fresh ingredients as it was supposed to be, that would be called the corrective experience. And you would say, all this time I've thought that that's what pad Thai was, when really that was just one disreputable restaurant. Well, it is time to have the corrective experience of human culture. Brief pause. So I'm intending to paint a picture here of a culture where it is normal and part of everyday daily existence to interact with beings from other far distant galaxies or other dimensions and having radically different perspectives. My personal responsibility in the events in Atlantis have to do with the choice to plunge humanity into a state of unknowing, unawareness, in order to set it free. So I was part of this telepathic community that, like a council, that made policy decisions. And we made the decision, I made the decision to cut the puppet strings, that were controlling humanity and holding Earth culture in a state of slavery. But understanding that doing so would be like a mental mind wipe. It would plunge humanity back to the very beginning, being unaware of where you came from, what events brought you to that moment, and having to start from square one. And I felt a great deal of personal responsibility in making that choice. And that's why I have come here in this form, in this lifetime, through the portal of the Flying Rainbow Lasagna. This is the other end of my bookend, or the other end of the parentheses that bracket this whole experience of cutting humanity's puppet strings and now returning to the Earth culture that is the result of living in a state of unconsciousness for tens of thousands of years, and returning with the necessary tool to reconnect humanity to the faculties that were lost, and in doing so, safeguard humanity from losing their sovereignty again. This is also the story of Inanna, the Sumerian goddess. I'll do a really brief version, but it is that she was born in heaven. She descended through 7 layers to the underworld. She was lured there under false pretenses, and then was horribly tortured by the queen of the underworld until she was fed manna from heaven and then ascended back up through the 7 layers. She ate the food of heaven and returned to her exalted state. And the difference was she's older and wiser. She's never going to fall down into the depths of the underworld again or fall for that ploy or the trick that led her to give up her magical implements and go down into the underworld. These myths exist in order to help humans stay strong during their own journey through the underworld. So the flying rainbow lasagna is meant to be the connective integument to reconnect you to your higher faculties. When humanity was plunged down after Atlantis, first of all, yes, there was the physical destruction of all of the houses and buildings and roads and everything that makes a culture. And there was not only the accidental physical destruction of those things that happened due to the huge cataclysmic upheaval. There was also intentional destruction of any kind of artifacts that would be left behind that would remind people of what had happened and what had come from. And you must understand that these policy decisions were made by a group. Not like one person said, I am going to do this, and it's not like there was unity and consensus. So like on the surface of Earth right now, there's a group of extreme people who have been blowing up and dynamiting these ancient statues of Buddha that are in these caves in Afghanistan. They're like these treasures of the world, ancient sculptures that were carved out of the mountainside by people expressing their faith, and they've been there undisturbed for hundreds of years. But there's a very small radical sect that is blowing them up in order to deface them. Of course, Earth has a population of 13 billion people, many billions of people. And by far the greater proportion of Earth's citizens feel that it is wrong to destroy the giant Buddha statues. But it only takes a group of a dozen to say, something, we want to sanitize this area. We want to wipe this cultural remnant from this area so that the people that live here don't know the history of what has gone on here. It only took a small proportion of the group of beings that were active on in this project to determine that they wanted to deface and destroy all possible artifacts so that humans would not have any little clues. Of course, no matter how much you think you've vacuumed up all of the evidence, there's still a little bit of evidence left behind. So this is how we can understand things such as, check out the work of Michael Tellinger. He does a lot of alternative archaeology based in South Africa. He has found evidence of gold mines that were there in far antiquity, deep antiquity, that he believes are the gold mine operations that were run by the Anunnaki described in the ancient Sumerian tablets, the ones that were translated by Zecharia Sitchin. And there's a great picture of Michael Tellinger found this footprint that is literally longer than 6 feet in length. It looks like a human footprint. And it also looks like it was made in soft clay, even though it's in a rock that is like granite, something that is very hard. It is a mystery and a clue, but I think you can understand where it's coming from. So basically, some of the clues that I'll give you are the process of removing gold and mining gold. Some of the chemical processes used can lead to a stone that is similar to concrete, like it is a wet slurry that can take an impression, and then when it dries rock hard. And these are byproducts of the gold mining process. So it is surmised that there was an amount of this like plaster or concrete-like substance that was created as a byproduct of the gold mining processes there. And we're talking deep antiquity, like, more than 100,000 years ago. And that an enormous person who would leave a footprint of 1 foot that is 6 feet long stepped in that area and left that behind. So there's a couple of different things here also. The surface of Earth has radically changed since the time of Atlantis. The formation of the continents and where they are placed and what they are shaped like really radically changed. So this was part of the cataclysmic restructuring of Earth, and it happened because your free will and sovereignty and bliss has everything to do with creating a vortex of energy that stabilizes Earth and Earth's gravity and Earth's own beautiful, elegant dance through space. And when Earth culture became destabilized and enslaved, it destabilized Earth's gravity. I mean, humans just don't recognize at this moment how connected your own consciousness is to the entity of Earth or Gaia or Terra. And when you destabilize the consciousnesses of humans, you're destabilizing the Earth's consciousness herself. You're literally like neurons in her brain. And I would say that Gaia or Terra is like a patient that has epilepsy, because epilepsy is defined by areas of the brain that are firing not harmoniously with other areas of the brain. And when we talk about, a small group of people that wants to dynamite a bunch of Buddha statues out of existence in order to culturally sanitize their area, that's similar to having an epileptic seizure or other aspects of Earth culture that are not in divine harmony. So the structure of the land on Earth was radically changed with the fall of Atlantis. People that lived in the Atlantis culture were disseminated or split apart into various places. As I said before, they went to various different places in the world and kept alive little puzzle pieces and aspects of what was known to be true in the mystery school teachings. So it became Tibetan Buddhism, a lot of the Hindu tradition, the idea of chi or prana, the non-physical energy of vitality and life that flows through us. This was, of course, well known about in the time of Atlantis. And, flash forward, let's talk about the Great Pyramid. What is known as the Great Pyramid, or the Pyramid at Giza, the central pyramid, the largest one, the one that is known, has the king's and the queen's chamber inside of it. I'm going to lay it all out for you right here. And I will also tell you that I do not have scholarly research or papers to give to you to tell you that this is true. I am giving you my direct perception, and do not say anything more than this is what I have seen to be true. Atlantis, total cataclysm, fall, and then there were many non-Earth sophisticated cultures who cared about the outcome, who saw what was happening here, felt a sense of inner responsibility, and wanted to help out the survivors, beings who had been cast down to the depths of depravity where, right now in your house, you're used to, if you're cold, turn on the heat, right? Well, unless you heat with a fireplace. I have friends that heat with wood, but mostly we live in quote-unquote modern structures where if you're cold, turn up the thermostat, right? And this is definitely how it was in Atlantis. People lived in great comfort. People had all sorts of conveniences, and that was suddenly cataclysmically taken away. And people had to learn, how do you build a shelter in the woods? How do you make a campfire and stay warm? And then, having to hunt and kill animals for food, and dealing with the mental degradation because, as I said, there was a mind wipe. So it's not like people were plunged into, it's not like people took their daily sophisticated mentality and were simply put out in the woods without any of their fancy doodads. Oh, no. If that were true, then they would have used their psychic powers to talk to one another. They would have used their psychic powers to kindle a flame. They would have used their psychic powers to ask for food and have an animal present itself, for consumption. Life was so different in Atlantis. It is difficult for me to even describe to you how qualitatively different it was. But when people say Garden of Eden, very similar to that, before the slavery, of course, before the slavery. Well, the Great Pyramid at Giza was created as a beacon for the raising of consciousness, because it was understood that humanity had just been totally walloped and a knockout punch, like Rocky knocking out his opponent, and had to slowly shake it off and figure it out, just like in a cartoon. Birds are flying around the person who has just been knocked out, and they have to get up, and they're disheveled and they don't know what's going on. And it was necessary for this to happen culturally, meaning that it took hundreds, if not thousands of years for culture to begin to arise again. So there were beings from other star systems who wanted to help culture to arise again. And these beings created what is known here in this time and place as the Great Pyramid. So Great Pyramid is absolutely evidence of extraterrestrial, non-earthly, high sophisticated culture. And truly the pyramid cannot be replicated even with what current surface Earth culture has as its highest technology. Even if you got together 11 cranes that are big enough to lift, the space shuttle, it would still be difficult to engineer to perform an engineering feat on the level of the Great Pyramid. They would still not be able to do it today. It was, first of all, when the pyramid was functional, it performed an energetic function and an esoteric function. So yes, the pyramid, and so there are the 3 original pyramids, and they worked together to create a source of energy, the way that we have power plants, like a nuclear power plant to create energy. And the pyramids also were emitters of consciousness, like raising your consciousness, creating sophistication within proximity. The extraterrestrials who made the Great Pyramids did it intending to give a leg up to the beings that lived within that area. So, there were beings that lived all over the surface of Earth. The humans that lived closer to the pyramid began to get organized more quickly. I wanted to say began to get their SHIT together more quickly. They began to form culture, and they worked with the extraterrestrials. But because the humans at that point were in a degraded mental format, they saw the extraterrestrials as gods or demigods. So now you're starting to understand where a lot of the Egyptian religion came from, a misinterpretation of these godlike beings. Thoth, the god known as Thoth, but really his name is pronounced Tehote. Tehote is one of these extraterrestrial teachers. And in the mythology of ancient Egypt, Tehote brought writing and other vital forms of culture to the culture that was turning into what we know as Egypt. So now I want to tell you a little bit about what life was like at Amarna. This is where Akhenaten, father of Tutankhamun, and husband, I want to say wife of, husband of Nefertiti. Akhenaten is a very special person in Egyptian culture because the Egyptians were given the pyramid to raise their cultural vibration. Of course, they didn't have their mentality completely correct and worshipped a lot of these extraterrestrials as gods, and eventually, over the course of tens of thousands of years, fell into a type of factionalism where, various factions worshipped various gods, and the gods are now in quotes, and those gods shared their favor or their energy or their technology with certain beings, but not with other beings. And it was a polytheistic culture, but really of worship of extraterrestrials as if they are gods. And Akhenaten was a redirector, getting people to understand the primacy of the sun in terms of consciousness and the emanations of divine consciousness. And our current history remembers him as the inceptor of monotheism, that Akhenaten basically taught the Egyptians, stop worshiping the pantheon of multiple gods and worship the primary god, which is Ra, the sun god Ra. And during his lifetime, Akhenaten changed the seat of power from where it was to this community further down the Nile in Amarna, and it became a psychedelic paradise. First of all, you have to understand that they used a potion known to contain a plant called the blue lotus, which is a psychedelic plant. And they probably used a lot of other psychedelic substances, a brew or a mixture of many different plant entheogens in order to reach higher states of consciousness. And the worship, when it happened, was actually interdimensional contact, and it was more along the lines of a spectacular rock concert. So the way that worship happened in ancient Egypt, before it became corrupted, of course, was it involved interdimensional and extraterrestrial life, where portals would be opened between this realm and other realms, and giant illuminated vessels would come through and be visible. It would be like the most amazing laser light shows. If you could imagine beams of colored light shooting out of the pyramids, emanating from vehicles of light, and the entire culture took part in these spectacles, but most people were the awed observers, like the concert goers at a rock concert, headbanging, not the performers. And the performers were the elite. They were the pharaoh. So Akhenaten and Nefertiti, these were like the rock stars of their time. And they themselves, Akhenaten and Nefertiti and Tutankhamun, were human extraterrestrial hybrids. So here's some interesting stuff that you can research on your own if you're inclined. Akhenaten, when he became empowered, started a new style of artwork. Up until that point, a lot of the Egyptian artwork was highly stylized and idealized. That means that the pharaoh, if the pharaoh had a pot belly, he was not sculpted in his commemorative statues as having a pot belly. He was sculpted as having a fine, perfectly muscular form. Same thing with baldness. Yes, they had male pattern baldness in Egypt, and no, they didn't show that people were bald until Akhenaten came into power, and he said, I decree this is a new era where you're only allowed to present truth in artwork. And then we begin to see on some of the paintings pictures of ancient Egyptians who are bald and who have a paunch or a fat belly, or who are otherwise not ideal in their forms. And it is in that era of artistic expression that we see Akhenaten presented as having, yes, a paunch or a pot belly, and also strangely shaped hips and knees that seem to be reverse or double jointed. And his children also seem to be very strangely proportioned. And here's the big one, elongated skulls, that both Nefertiti and Tutankhamun and Akhenaten are portrayed in two-dimensional art, like the flat, hieroglyphic type chiseling, low relief sculptures, and also in actual sculptures as having elongated skulls. And the elongated skulls were actual physical manifestations of the hybridization process that was happening as humanity in its undeveloped state was being acculturated or cultivated into a sophisticated state. I will also tell you, folks, that Marfan's syndrome, this is disease of the connective tissue. It's a genetic disorder that they say that Abe Lincoln had Marfan syndrome, or they presume that he did. It is a genetic disorder that actually comes to us by way of Pharaoh Akhenaten, that the hybridization process that he was undergoing, first of all, it did not lead to eternal life. Akhenaten died. He was mummified. And I'll also tell you, there was a huge upheaval. Tutankhamun, his son, was murdered. And the reign of Akhenaten was almost sanitized, was almost wiped away. No one knew about it. They dismantled Amarna, took apart the psychedelic, amazing city that he had built. But the funny thing is, what they used to do in Egypt, when they took something apart, they would use the bricks to kind of they'd use it as landfill. So they kind of used the stuff that they had dismantled in such a way that it preserved it perfectly. And all of those bricks were able to be excavated and put back into their original positions by present archaeologists. So Akhenaten was not wiped from the consciousness. We remember him, we know what happened, and we know that Egypt returned to a state of polytheism, and that the redirection of consciousness and refocusing of consciousness dissipated. So this is another example of a being who came as an avatar or a container for ideas from a higher realm in order to help people to grow from their present state of being mentally disheveled. So the concept of the Merkaba, or the light body vessel, comes to us by way of the ancient Egyptian mystery traditions. It actually comes to us from ancient Atlantis. All of the things, and then I can get into this. We're at the end of this broadcast, but in future broadcasts, we'll talk more about how the ancient Egyptian, what is known as the funerary religion, or, the process of mummification and the idea of death is not the end, but that it is possible to be revivified, is where Messianic Judaism comes from, is where Christianity comes from, and is essentially where we have the idea of an end of days and a resurrection of humanity. So all of this goes back to the Great Pyramid. Lessons for Full Spectrum Humans. Please enroll in the class. You can check that out on my website, flyingrainbowlasagna.com. Thank you so much for tuning in.